and welcome back. My name is Jennifer, and in this video I'm going to show you how to turn this IKEA shelf into a witch's apothecary cabinet inspired by Hogwarts Legacy. And here you can see the design that I had created in Photoshop. So I'm going to try to make 3 rows of these tiny squared drawers, and the lowest part is supposed to be like these kind of rectangular looking drawers. So as you can see here, I have these insert drawers and doors that I want to give the illusion that they are many of these tiny drawers that you can see in, for example, an old apothecary cabinet. So I have some of these wood fiber boards. There are back pieces from some of these picture frames that I'm not using anymore, and these are going to be perfect to create the illusion that I'm going for, to have more of that kind of design that you can see in some of these old cabinets. What I'm going to do is just remove all of these metal pieces that are on these wood fiber boards. Then I'm going to trace out the designs that I'm going for, and I'm going to create 3 rows that is going to give the illusion of some squared looking drawers, and the lowest row is going to have these rectangular looking drawers. And once I have traced all the lines onto the wood fiber boards, I'm going to cut the pieces out using a knife. To get a nicer looking finish and more of a smoother edge to all of these pieces, I'm going to sand the corners down for more of a rounded looking edge effect, using first a rough grit sandpaper and then use a high grit sandpaper to smoothen out the surface. Then using a mixture of wall filler and some of the sanding dust from all these wood fiber boards, I'm going to fill in all of these holes from the metal pieces that I removed earlier. I'm not going for a smooth, perfect finish for this because I want that kind of rough looking rustic finish anyways, but I just want to make sure that I don't have many holes in all of these wood fiber pieces. So I decided to remove all of these kind of chipboard pieces that are attached to the drawers, and I also filled in the hole where the knob was before, so I would have a smooth, clean surface when I'm going to attach the wood fiber pieces. Then once the filler had dried, I just sanded it down using the same steps with the sandpaper that I used earlier. So to create the illusion that these are supposed to look like separate square drawers, I'm first going to place the wood fiber pieces onto this chipboard, and then I'm going to trace where I want to attach this kind of groove effect that is going to give the illusion that these are separate pieces. So I'm first going to trace the line where I'm going to add the groove, and then I'm going to use this hacksaw just to get some grooves in the corners on this line. And first here you can see that I'm using just a regular saw when I'm going to go over the line, but I felt it was much easier if I first just went over with a tiny groove using a file, and then when I had a tiny groove on the surface of this chipboard, I went over with the saw to get a much deeper groove, and then I finished off with the file and then some sandpaper to smoothen out and round the edges to get more the illusion of a gap in between what's supposed to be these drawers. Then it was time to measure out that I had all of these pieces centered, because now it was time to attach these wood fiber pieces onto the chipboard. And after I had measured out where the center was, I just used regular contact glue to glue them into place. Just to make it easier for myself later, so I don't have to go over with any kind of pencil marks after I have painted all of these pieces, I now make sure that I trace out where the screw holes for all of these label holders are going to be. So here you can see I'm measuring out where the center is, and then I'm going to mark out where the holes for the screw holes are going to be, and then I'm going to use a tiny drill just to make sure that I drill down a hole so I have a perfect demarcation where the screws are going to be later. And then I decided also to widen the holes a bit using a sewing awl. And now comes the fun part, which is adding this kind of antique rustic paint finish to these drawers. So these are some screenshots that I took of the actual game when I was playing in the room of requirement, and this is the style that I'm going for when I'm going to do this paint job on these drawers. So it's a deeper base tone, but then it's going to have these highlights that is going to be brighter and brighter and add more of that kind of damaged rustic effect. And I'm going to work in thin layers so the paint can dry much faster in between each layer. So I'm going to first go over with a black chalk paint for this, so I have a dark base to start with. And I decided that I wanted to have an opaque finish, because at first I made it very transparent because I thought that I wanted to have this illusion of wood grain effect, but I wasn't really a big fan of that finish, so I decided to go over with 2 to 3 layers of this black chalk paint to get an opaque finish. Then I went over with this dark reddish brown matte paint, and this one I added in a dry brush technique, and I decided to go with that kind of blended effect with a lighter tone in the center and then start to blend it out. And then I want to have more of a contrast to this effect, so I decided to go over with this paint on all of the edges around these drawers just to add more of the effect of some highlights. Then I did the same effect, but I went over with a brighter and brighter shade. So this time I'm going over with a rustic shade that is more closer to a orange tint, but not as bright. And then I went over with an even brighter tint, where I mixed in some of this yellow ochre acrylic paint to this rustic shade. Once all of those paint finishes was done, I added a layer of this brown antique wax mixed in with some of this liquid furniture wax, just so I have a protective finish over all of these paints that I have added. So this is pretty much what I was going for when I was looking at the reference pictures, but I felt like I was playing it a little bit too safe, so I wanted to add some colors to these drawers, because some of the furniture that you can actually get in the room of requirement in the game, they actually do have some of these fun looking colors to them. So I wanted to have more of the green effect to these drawers. So I made a mixture of some of these phthalo green pan pastel that I have mixed in with some of the white chalk paint that I had, and you're going to notice here that I'm going to add this on all of the edges around the wood fiber pieces that I have added earlier, and I added these in a dry brush technique, meaning as little paint as possible, because I wanted to have the ability to build up if I wanted to have more and more vibrancy to the colors. Then I decided to go over with an even more orangey rust tint to highlight all of the edges, but you're going to notice that I'm going to go over these areas once more, but with the same green tint that I added earlier, because I wasn't really a big fan of this intense orange tint, so I decided to go over with a tint over it, but I made sure that some of this rustic orangey shade was actually peeking through underneath, but wasn't as intense as it was before. I also rubbed in a tiny amount of this golden wax just to enhance more of that metallic effect that matched the label holders that I'm going to attach later. Then to enhance the grooves that I had added, I decided to go in with a watered down black acrylic paint just to make sure that I have more of a shadow effect in between these drawers. Then it was finally time to add these label holders. Like I mentioned earlier, I had added these holes where the screws are going to be attached. So the only thing I had to do was just widen the holes a bit more again with a sewing awl. And then it was just time to attach the label holders just using a screwdriver. So before I start to do any kind of paint job on the actual IKEA shelf, I'm going to do a little bit of prep work here. So you're going to see that I'm using some of this filler on some damaged parts, and I'm also filling in some holes that I'm definitely not going to have any use for in the future. And then you're going to see that I'm going to use some of this silicone to fill in some of the gaps between some of these shelves that I have here. It's not really that necessary, but I just felt like it was a little bit nice to have this smooth transition in all of these corners of the shelves. So I first decided to add a layer of this black chalk paint that I used earlier, but this one is a little bit diluted with water because I wanted to create sort of a grain effect to all the white surfaces that I have here. So I wanted to enhance a little bit of that effect here. So I went over with one layer, and since I'm going to add these inserts later, I only added a little bit of paint on the sides and the top part on these open compartments because I felt like it wasn't that necessary to fill all the areas with paint. And I did the exact same technique and steps on all of the outer parts on the shelf. And you're going to notice that I really tried to focus on adding the wood grain effect on the top part of the shelf and the sides. And I also decided to go over with another layer using the same brushstroke technique, but only on the outer parts of the shelf, because these are the areas that are going to be the most visible. Then to add the same layers of paint that I used on the drawers earlier, I'm going to go over with the same gray, reddish brown paint that I used earlier, and this one I'm going to add in the dry brush technique, but also try to enhance more of that grain effect. I also added some interesting textures on a piece of tissue paper and just dabbed a tiny amount of the paint on all of the thinner areas all around the shelf. Just like I did earlier, I wanted to play around with the shades of green, and here you can actually see that I'm first just going over with straight up pan pastel, and I dabbed some of this blue pan pastel and then some of this green pan pastel, but later on you're going to notice that I wasn't really that happy with this application. It was too spotty and random, and I felt like I wanted to have more of a thought out plan when it comes to the green parts of this shelf. So on the actual compartment part or the open parts, those shelves, I kept this green and blue tint, but when it comes to the outer visible parts on the actual shelf, I decided to first spray everything with some fixative spray, but then I went over with this brown finishing wax, which actually muted down some of this pan pastel that I had added, and then I decided to go just with this straight up pan pastel in the green shade and go for more of a gradient look. You could, however, see that on the sides of the shelf, I added more of a gradient look where I started to go in more of a waterfall effect where it was for more intense colors high up and then it started to fade downwards. So I kept that look, but just wanted to make sure that I enhanced that effect more with the green pan pastel instead of adding the blue one. I also gave a little bit of this rust effect using some of this rusty, orangey tinted chalk paint on all of the edges, just to add a little bit more contrast to all of the shades. And since I'm actually very inspired by the shades of dark arts, especially the shades that you can see in the game, I felt like this was going to enhance more of that illusion that this is supposed to be a dark arts inspired cabinet. I also decided to enhance this damaged part that I have here that looks like some sort of very long lighting bolt, and I felt like it was going to be fitting the theme that I was going for anyways, so I wasn't really that bothered by the fact that the filler hadn't actually removed this damaged part. It actually gave it more of an interesting look to the entire cabinet. I still felt that the pan pastel wasn't really giving me that intense look that I was going for, because it was so dusty that the dust was starting to actually fall off the cabinet, and I felt like the pan pastel was muted down as soon as I sprayed it with some of the fixative. So I decided to use the paint that I had earlier, where I had this green pan pastel mixed in with some chalk paint, and started to paint it with as little paint as possible so I could build it up. And then I went over with damp sponge just to get some more cool effects where the paint has started to drag a bit, so it gives the illusion of some glowy bits on all of these green shades. You're going to notice it when I'm going to paint it on the sides of the shelf. That is, first I'm going over with tiny brush strokes downwards with the brush, and then I'm going over with the sponge to get this kind of cool look to the paint. So I wasn't really that happy with the shade that I had going on here, because it was looking too teal for my taste. I wanted it to be more closer to green when we were talking about dark arts here. So I decided to go over with some of this olive green pastel and started to rub it on the surface on top of all of these teal areas. And that made sure that I had a transparent layer of this olive green, and mixed in with the teal, it gave me more of that kind of intense, almost viridian green or juniper green that I was going for. So for the inserts, I decided to go over with a layer of black chalk paint on the parts that is going to be shown on the back side of the cabinet. And I did this in a layer that's going to give the illusion of some kind of wood grain effect. So now it was time to add the inserts to the cabinet, and you're going to notice one thing here, and that is that since these inserts are a little bit snug when they are getting inserted into the actual cabinet, they started to remove some of the chalk paint here. So some of the corners are going to remove some of the paint, but I'm going to off camera repaint these parts so they are not going to be visible when I'm going to attach the drawers and the doors. So for the legs of the cabinet, I'm going to use these wooden legs. They are around 5 inches long, so it's going to make the cabinet a lot taller than it was before. And these ones are going to be painted the same steps that I used before, but the only difference is that I'm not going to add any of the green to this one. I'm going to just create the look of some black and some brown wood grain effects here. Then it was time to attach the legs to the bottom part of the cabinet. And to do this, I just flipped the entire cabinet over so the underside was facing up, and then I started to measure out where I wanted these legs to be attached. I didn't know this before, but it turns out that the actual surface area where I wanted to attach the legs first turns out to be a thin layer of this chipboard. So it was actually hollow on the inside, which I didn't know. I thought it was going to be a thick piece of chipboard here. So I thought at first that I was going to roll with it and hopefully the legs were going to be attached in place, but then it turns out that they were not going to be fitting there at all. So I'm going to remove them and attach them more closer to the edges of the actual cabinet later. And just to make sure that the entire cabinet has the same colors, I decided to paint the bottom part also with the black chalk paint and then going over with just shades that match the rest of the cabinet. Then it was finally time to reattach all of the chipboards to the drawers and all of the metal fittings to the doors. Since the inserts aren't attached with any screws yet, I just temporarily place all of the drawers into place just so I can see how much further in or out the inserts need to be, because I wanted them to be a bit further out so they were flush to the edges of the actual cabinet so the drawers weren't too far in. And once I was happy with all the adjustments that I had made, it was time to attach all of the inserts to the inside of the cabinet. So here you're going to see that I'm going to attach the metal fittings to the back side of all of the drawers. And once that was done, I was going to do the same thing that I did on the drawers, which is adjusting the inserts that I have added to make sure that the drawers are flush to the edges of the actual cabinet. So it was in a placement that I was happy with. And then I could start attaching the inserts with screws on the inside of the cabinet and then attach the doors by attaching them to the inserts. And since this cabinet is supposed to be a Hogwarts Legacy inspired cabinet, I thought that the best way to enhance this effect was to use some labels that were inspired ingredients and other apothecary labels that would fit the Hogwarts universe. And I actually have the perfect paper here for these labels, which actually is a piece of cardstock that you can actually use in a printer, and it has a surface that looks like old discolored papers. So I just used this one and created some of these labels in Photoshop and used different fonts that would fit all of the different ingredients, and I made sure that the measurements was perfect for the label holders so the labels would show up, and then it was time to start inserting them into the label holders. And that's it. That's the finished result. That's how I turn my IKEA KALLAX shelf into a dark arts apothecary cabinet inspired by Hogwarts Legacy. I hope you really enjoyed this video and maybe got some ideas or inspirations on a makeover you can give your own IKEA KALLAX or some other furniture that you want to upgrade or give this kind of cool, witchy, magical makeover. So that's it for this video, and I'll see you in the next one.